stand. September 17, 1944. The sky over the Netherlands is a canvas of white parachutes and gliders, thousands strong, descending like snowflakes in summer. Below, fields stretch green and peaceful, belying the horror to come. Operation Market Garden, Field Marshal Montgomery's bold plan to end the war by Christmas, has begun. Among the parachutes, the red berets of the British 1st Airborne Division stand out like drops of blood against the blue sky. These are Britain's finest, tasked with the most ambitious objective: capture the bridge at Arnhem, the northernmost and final link in a chain that would allow Allied forces to pour into Germany's industrial heartland. The men of the 1st Airborne believe they face only second-rate German troops, remnants of a defeated army. They could not be more wrong. In the gliders carrying heavy equipment, Lieutenant John Frost checks his watch for the 10th time. At 30, he's already a veteran of North Africa and Sicily, but this mission feels different, bigger, more important. The intelligence reports suggest light resistance, a quick in and out operation. Home by Christmas, they'd been told. Frost adjusts his red beret, the symbol of airborne elite status, and runs through the plan one more time in his mind. Sees the bridge hold for 48 hours, wait for XXX Corps to link up. Simple, clean, effective. Outside his glider, the Dutch countryside rushes by, deceptively serene. Meanwhile, 60 miles away, the tanks of XXX Corps rumble to life. Lieutenant Brian Horrocks, commanding the ground forces, feels the weight of expectation on his shoulders. The plan depends entirely on his ability to race up a single narrow road, crossing bridges captured by airborne forces before the Germans can react. It's a straight shot up the highway, Montgomery had assured him, like a knife through butter. But as Horrocks surveys the road ahead, narrow, elevated, with ditches on either side perfect for ambush, he feels a twinge of doubt. The intelligence reports had been so optimistic, almost dismissive of German capabilities. Yet something nagged at him, a feeling that this was too good to be true. In Berlin, Field Marshal Walter Model receives reports of the Allied landings with surprising calm. "They're coming right to us," he tells his staff. Perfect. Unknown to Allied intelligence, 2 elite SS Panzer divisions had been resting and refitting near Arnhem, precisely where the British 1st Airborne was dropping. Among them is the battle-hardened 9th SS Panzer Division, Hohenstaufen, commanded by the ruthless but brilliant Walter Haase. As German soldiers scramble to their positions, the distinctive red berets of the British paratroopers are clearly visible through binoculars. "The English are walking into a meat grinder," one German officer remarks with grim satisfaction. The red berets, meant to symbolize elite status, now serve as perfect targets. Back in the skies over Arnhem, Private James Simpson floats down toward what should be a quiet drop zone. Instead, he hears the unmistakable crack of rifle fire below. This isn't right, he thinks, panic rising in his throat. The intelligence said no resistance here. As he lands, rolling to absorb the impact as trained, he sees other paratroopers taking fire, some falling before they can even unclip their chutes. The red berets that seemed so proud moments ago now make them conspicuous targets. Simpson scrambles for cover, his heart pounding, the reality of their situation dawning with terrifying clarity. They had been lied to. The bridge at Arnhem wasn't just far. It was impossibly far, guarded by forces they never expected to face. The optimism of fools. The sun was still low in the sky on that fateful Sunday morning, casting long shadows across the English airfields. The air hummed with a peculiar energy, a mixture of adrenaline, excitement, and the profound, almost naive, optimism that comes with a plan so audacious it feels destined to succeed. At RAF Boxton Heath, the men of the 1st Airborne Division's reconnaissance squadron made their final checks. Their mission was critical: to seize the bridge at Arnhem by coup de main, a lightning strike before the Germans knew what hit them. They were the tip of the spear, and their commander, Major Freddie Go, embodied the spirit of the operation. He gathered his officers, his face a mask of confidence. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying over the drone of engines, 48 hours. That's all we need. By this time Tuesday, we'll be having tea in Berlin." The men laughed, a nervous, hopeful sound. They believed him. How could they not? The Allied war machine seemed unstoppable. Since D-Day, they had broken out of Normandy, liberated Paris, and were chasing the Germans back to their homeland at a pace that astonished even the most optimistic planners. The German army, they were told, was a broken shell, its units in disarray, its morale shattered. The red berets on their heads were not just headgear. They were a declaration of invincibility. Hundreds of miles away, in his headquarters at Versailles, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery reviewed the final details of Market Garden for the last time. He was a man of supreme self-confidence, a commander who believed in the power of a single, decisive thrust to shatter an enemy's will. The broad front strategy favored by Eisenhower, he argued, would dissipate Allied strength, leading to a slow, grinding war of attrition that would bleed both sides white through another winter. Market Garden was the antidote, a narrow, of deep thrust. 3 airborne divisions, the American 101st and 82nd and the British 1st, would land in the Netherlands, capturing a series of bridges spanning the major rivers and canals that formed natural barriers into Germany. They would hold these bridges for 2, perhaps 3 days, while the British XXX Corps, a powerful armored fist, thundered up a single highway, designated Hell's Highway, to link up with them. Once across the Rhine at Arnhem, the northern flank of the Siegfried Line would be turned, and the plains of North Germany would lie open, a direct route to the Ruhr, the industrial heart of the Third Reich. The plan was elegant in its simplicity, breathtaking in its ambition. It was, Montgomery believed, the masterstroke that would end the war. He dismissed the nagging doubts of his subordinates, the concerns about the single road, the questions about German strength in the area. The enemy is finished, he insisted. He has no reserves left. His staff officers nodded, their own reservations buried under the weight of their commander's certainty. The red berets of the airborne were, in Montgomery's mind, the perfect instrument for this perfect plan. On the ground in the Netherlands, the Dutch people watched the armada of aircraft with a mixture of terror and elation. For 5 long years, they had endured the brutal occupation of the Nazis. Starvation was a constant threat, reprisals for resistance activities a daily reality. Now, the sky was filled with the planes of their liberators. In the town of Oosterbeek, near Arnhem, a young Dutch girl named Anne watched from her attic window as the first parachutes blossomed against the blue sky. At first, she thought they were German paratroopers, a new terror descending upon them. But then she saw the distinctive shapes of the Allied aircraft and her heart leaped. She ran downstairs to tell her parents, her voice trembling with a hope she hadn't felt in years. "It's them, the English. They've come." Her father, a man whose face was etched with the lines of hardship and fear, cautiously opened the door. The sound of gunfire was already echoing in the distance, not the celebratory welcome they had imagined, but the sharp, deadly crack of battle. The optimism that fueled the Allied High Command had filtered down to the occupied peoples, a promise of imminent freedom. But the sounds they heard now were not the sounds of a liberation parade. They were the sounds of a fight. Inside the gliders carrying the 1st Airborne's jeeps and anti-tank guns, the mood was tense but focused. These were the men who would provide the heavy punch, the support that the lightly armed paratroopers desperately needed. Sergeant Bill Watson, a veteran of the North African campaign, checked the securing straps on his 6-pounder anti-tank gun for the 3rd time. He'd seen enough combat to know that no plan survives first contact with the enemy. The intelligence briefings had been almost insulting in their simplicity. "Expect only old men and boys," they'd been told. "The SS Panzer divisions you're worried about are refitting miles from here." Watson wasn't convinced. He'd fought the SS before. They didn't break, they didn't run, and they certainly didn't just disappear. He looked at the young faces of the men around him, their eyes bright with the promise of a quick victory and a trip home. He wanted to believe it, he really did. But a cold knot of dread had formed in his stomach. The glider hit the ground with a jarring crash, the door flying open. Watson and his crew scrambled out, their boots sinking into the soft Dutch earth. The first thing Watson saw was not a welcoming committee of Dutch civilians, but a German half-track emerging from the tree line, its machine gun spitting fire. The intelligence was wrong, horribly, catastrophically wrong. The war was not over. It was here, and it was furious. The German response was swift and surprisingly coordinated. Far from being a broken force, the German High Command had anticipated an Allied push towards the Rhine. Field Marshal Model, a defensive genius, had been patching together a new line of defense. Crucially, 2 battle-hardened SS Panzer divisions, the 9th and 10th, had been ordered to rest and refit in the quiet area around Arnhem, precisely where the British 1st Airborne was dropping. The Allies had missed this critical piece of intelligence. Ultra-decrypts, the invaluable source of information from broken German codes, had hinted at the presence of elite troops, but the analysts at SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, had downplayed the reports, believing the units were under strength and incapable of major action. It was a fatal misjudgment. On the ground, the German commanders reacted with professional efficiency. General Wilhelm Bittrich, commander of the II-SS Panzer Corps, saw the airborne landings not as a disaster, but as an opportunity. "The English have made a grave mistake," he told his staff. "They have landed right on top of 2 of our best divisions. We will destroy them here." He immediately ordered his troops to cut off the British drop zones and prevent them from concentrating their forces. The German soldiers, many of them hardened veterans of the Eastern Front, moved with a speed and ferocity that the British had not anticipated. The Red Berets, meant to be the vanguard of a triumphant advance, were suddenly isolated, surrounded, and fighting for their lives. For the paratroopers on the ground, the transition from optimism to shock was instantaneous and brutal. Private James Simpson, huddled in a ditch outside Arnhem, watched in disbelief as a German Panzer IV tank rumbled past, its turret swiveling towards a group of British soldiers who had just landed. The 6-pounder anti-tank guns. The only weapons capable of stopping such armor were still in their gliders, many of which had been shot down or landed miles off course. The British paratroopers were armed with little more than rifles, Sten guns, and PIATs, projector infantry anti-tank, a weapon that was notoriously inaccurate and required a soldier to be suicidally close to his target. Simpson saw a brave young lieutenant try to take on the tank with a PIAT. He fired, the bomb arcing through the air and striking the tank's side with a dull thud. It did nothing. The tank's machine gunner turned his weapon on the lieutenant, cutting him down in a hail of bullets. Simpson felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't the walk in the park they had been promised. This was a slaughter. The carefully constructed narrative of a collapsing German army evaporated in the face of the cold, hard steel of a panzer division. The red beret on Simpson's head, once a symbol of his elite status, now felt like a target, a beacon that drew death. He had come to liberate a bridge, but he was now trapped in a killing field, the victim of a plan built on a foundation of arrogance and wishful thinking. The bridge at Arnhem was not just far away. It was an impossible dream, and the cost of that dream was being paid in blood. Hell's Highway. The roar of the British Cromwell and Sherman tanks was a physical force, vibrating through the ground and rattling the windows of the liberated Belgian towns they passed. For the men of XXX Corps, this was the moment they had been waiting for. The long, bloody slog from the Normandy beaches was over. Now, they were the cavalry, the armored fist tasked with smashing through the German lines and linking up with the airborne troops holding the bridges ahead. The plan was simple, almost brutally so. Follow one road, Highway 69, all the way to Arnhem. 64 miles. That was all that stood between them and victory. 64 miles to end the war. The mood in the lead tanks was electric. "We'll be there in 2 days," a young tank commander boasted to his crew over the intercom. Maybe less. They had been told to expect light resistance, a mopping-up operation against a defeated foe. The intelligence reports, the same ones that had so disastrously misled the airborne forces, painted a picture of German disarray. The men of XXX Corps believed it. Why wouldn't they? The momentum of the Allied advance was overwhelming. The war felt like it was entering its final, glorious act. Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks, the commander of XXX Corps, stood in his command half-track, studying a map spread across a small table. He was a respected and experienced officer, but he felt a profound sense of unease. The plan, Montgomery's plan, relied on speed. It relied on everything going perfectly, and in war, nothing ever went perfectly. The single road, his main axis of advance, was a choke point. It was elevated in many places, with soft, marshy ground on either side, making it difficult for vehicles to maneuver off the asphalt. It was a perfect killing ground for a determined enemy. Horrocks had voiced his concerns, but Montgomery had been adamant. "Speed is your armor, Brian," the field marshal had said. "Don't stop for anything." And so Horrocks pushed his men. The advance began at 14:35 on September 17, just hours after the airborne landings. The initial progress was, as predicted, swift. They reached the first objective, the bridge at Eindhoven, captured by the American 101st Airborne by nightfall. The Dutch people cheered, throwing flowers and offering food and drink. It was a scene of unbridled joy, a powerful reinforcement of the narrative that this was a triumphant liberation march. But Horrocks couldn't shake the feeling that they were being funneled into a trap. The German response to the XXX Corps advance was not the disorganized defense of a broken army, but a calculated fighting retreat orchestrated by General Kurt Student, the master of airborne operations himself. Student understood the Allied plan perfectly. He knew that the British armor was constrained to a single road, and he intended to make them pay for every inch of it. He deployed his forces with surgical precision, using small, mobile units armed with anti-tank guns and self-propelled artillery to ambush the lead British tanks. They would strike, inflict casualties, and then melt back into the countryside before the British could bring their overwhelming firepower to bear. The result was a series of frustrating, bloody delays. A tank would round a bend and be hit by a concealed 88 gun, exploding in a fireball that blocked the road for hours. Engineers would be called forward to clear the wreckage under constant sniper fire, while infantrymen were tasked with flushing out the German gunners. The rapid, 2-day dash to Arnhem was turning into a slow, grinding war of attrition, exactly what Montgomery had wanted to avoid. Inside one of the lead Shermans, Corporal Arthur Arty Dean cursed as his tank shuddered to a halt. "What is it now?" the commander yelled over the intercom. "Roadblock, sir," Dean replied, peering through his periscope. "Looks like a felled tree and some debris." But they all knew it was more than that. It was an invitation to an ambush. The infantrymen of the Irish Guards, who were accompanying the tanks, dismounted and began to cautiously advance down the road, their rifles at the ready. The air was thick with tension. Every hedgerow, every building, every shadow could conceal a German soldier with a Panzerfaust, the deadly one-shot anti-tank weapon that could turn a multi-ton 20-ton tank into a burning coffin with a single hit. Dean watched the infantrymen, feeling a mix of admiration and pity. They were the ones who had to do the dirty work, clearing the path for the armor. Suddenly, the sharp crack of a German MG-42 machine gun echoed from a nearby farmhouse. The distinctive sound, like tearing canvas, sent a chill down Dean's spine. The infantrymen hit the ground, returning fire. The battle was joined again. Another delay, another hour lost. The 64 miles to Arnhem were beginning to feel like 1,000. Back at Arnhem, the situation for the 1st Airborne was deteriorating rapidly. The initial plan to seize the bridge by coup de main had failed. The German resistance was far too strong. Only a small element, led by Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, had managed to fight their way into the northern end of the bridge itself. They were now cut off, isolated in a small perimeter, surrounded by German armor and infantry. Frost and his men, numbering around 700, held on with incredible tenacity, turning the houses surrounding the bridge into miniature fortresses. From his command post in a building overlooking the river, Frost could see the German tanks moving on the southern bank, out of range of his PIATs. He could also see the empty road leading south, the road that XXX Corps was supposed to be thundering down. It remained stubbornly empty. The hours ticked by. 48 hours came and went. The promised relief did not arrive. The red berets of Frost's men were now stained with dust and blood, their uniforms torn, their supplies running low. They fought on, not for victory anymore, but for survival, and for the hope that their sacrifice would not be in vain. The German pressure on the main British perimeter, centered around the town of Oosterbeek, was relentless. The British paratroopers, lightly armed and outnumbered, were being pushed back yard by yard. The German tanks, particularly the formidable Tiger and Panther models, were virtually unstoppable. The British had no answer for them. Their own anti-tank guns were too few, too light, or had been lost in the chaotic landings. The battlefield became a landscape of burning buildings, shattered trees, and the crumpled wreckage of gliders. The air was thick with the acrid smell of cordite, diesel, and burning flesh. For Private James Simpson, the world had shrunk to the few feet of muddy trench he shared with 2 other soldiers. They were cold, hungry, and terrified. The initial optimism had been replaced by a grim, desperate resolve. They fought back with everything they had, firing their rifles until they were too hot to hold, throwing grenades when the Germans got too close. Simpson saw a German soldier charge their position, a bayonet fixed to his rifle. He raised his own rifle, his hands shaking, and pulled the trigger. The German fell. Simpson felt nothing. No triumph, no hatred, just a profound, soul-crushing weariness. He looked at the red beret lying in the mud beside him, knocked from a comrade's head by a stray bullet. It was no longer a symbol of elite status. It was just a piece of cloth, soaked in mud and blood like everything else. The failure of intelligence was now a stark, brutal reality on both ends of the battlefield. At XXX Corps headquarters, Horrocks was receiving updated reports that confirmed his worst fears. The German resistance was not only stiffening, it was being masterfully directed. The road to Arnhem was not a highway to victory. It was a killing ground. And at Arnhem, the men of the 1st Airborne were learning the terrible price of that failure. They had been sent to capture a bridge that was a bridge too far, not just in distance, but in conception. The plan had been built on a fantasy of German weakness, and now the fantasy was colliding with the terrible reality of German strength. The red berets, once a proud symbol of Allied might, were now scattered across the fields and streets of Arnhem and Oosterbeek, markers of a tragedy that was unfolding in slow motion. The men who wore them were not conquerors. They were victims of a colossal gamble that was going horribly wrong. The cauldron of Arnhem. The 3rd day of the battle dawned under a sky the color of bruised leaves. For the British 1st Airborne Division, trapped in the shrinking perimeter around Oosterbeek, the concept of time had become a cruel joke. The 48 hours they were promised to hold the bridge had stretched into an eternity of fire and steel. The initial objective, the magnificent road bridge at Arnhem, was now a distant, unreachable symbol, held by a dwindling band of heroes under Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, completely cut off from the main force. The focus had shifted from conquest to simple survival. The perimeter was a pocket of hell, a roughly 3-square-mile area pounded by German artillery, mortars, and tanks from 3 sides. The air was a toxic soup of smoke, cordite, and the sweet, cloying smell of death. Every building was a potential fortress or a tomb, every street a killing zone. The men were exhausted, running on fumes and adrenaline, their faces blackened with grime and gunpowder, their eyes hollow from lack of sleep and the constant, nerve-shattering noise. The red berets they wore were no longer a mark of distinction, but a target, a silent testament to their doomed mission. Inside the perimeter, a desperate, brutal rhythm had established itself. During the day, the Germans would launch relentless assaults, probing for weaknesses, sending in tanks and infantry to grind down the British defenses. The paratroopers would fight back with ferocious tenacity, using every weapon at their disposal. PIAT teams would lie in wait, sacrificing sacrificing themselves to get a shot off at a German tank, often with little effect. Snipers would pick off German officers and soldiers from the upper floors of houses. The fighting was close quarters, personal and savage. Men fought with rifles, bayonets, grenades, and even their bare hands in the rubble of what were once family homes. At night, a tense, eerie quiet would descend, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the occasional crack of a sniper's rifle. It was during these brief respites that the true cost of the battle became apparent. The medics working in cellars and under stairwells were overwhelmed. They had no morphine, no clean bandages, no anesthetics. Amputations were performed with saws and knives, the screams of the soldiers muffled by rags. The sight of a young man, his red beret still on his head, his leg a mangled ruin, was a common one. It was a vision of hell on earth. Private James Simpson had found a small measure of safety in the basement of a partially destroyed house on the outskirts of Oosterbeek. He was huddled with a dozen other men, all of them wounded, all of them terrified. The house above them was being used as a company headquarters, and the constant thud of German shells landing nearby shook the very foundation. Simpson had a shrapnel wound in his shoulder, a deep, throbbing pain that he tried to ignore. He was more worried about thirst. They had run out of water 2 days ago. The only liquid available was from a burst radiator pipe which tasted of rust and chemicals, but they drank it anyway. A young private next to him, no older than 19, was crying softly, calling for his mother. Simpson wanted to say something, to offer some words of comfort, but he had none. What could he say? They were trapped, surrounded, and abandoned. The promise of relief from XXX Corps had faded into a bitter, cynical joke. The only thing left was to wait, to fight, and to die. He looked at the red beret in his lap, caked in mud and dried blood. It felt like a relic from another life, a life of hope and purpose that now seemed impossibly distant. The bridge itself, Lieutenant Colonel John Frost and his men were enduring their own private hell. They had been holding the northern end for over 3 days, completely isolated, with no hope of reinforcement or resupply. The buildings they occupied were little more than shells, pockmarked by bullets and shell fire. The Germans had tried everything to dislodge them: infantry assaults, tank fire, and even flamethrowers. The British soldiers fought back with incredible courage, repelling wave after wave of attacks, but they were paying a terrible price. Their ammunition was almost gone. Their food and water had run out. The wounded lay everywhere, unable to be moved. Frost himself had been wounded in the legs, but he refused to be evacuated, continuing to direct the defense from his command post. He knew that his men were buying time that XXX Corps was failing to use. Every hour they held on was another hour of agony, but it was also another hour that the Germans were tied down, unable to focus their full attention on the main perimeter at Oosterbeek. The red berets of Frost's battalion were a beacon of defiance in the heart of the German positions, a symbol of a courage that bordered on the suicidal. The German commanders, particularly General Bittrich, were both impressed and infuriated by the British resistance. They could not understand why these paratroopers, so lightly armed and outnumbered, continued to fight with such ferocity. They had expected them to break, to surrender, but the British held on with a tenacity that bordered on the fanatical. Bittrich, a professional soldier, could not help but feel a grudging respect for his enemy. He knew that he was facing some of the best soldiers in the British Army, but respect did not change his mission. He was determined to annihilate the 1st Airborne Division, to crush it completely. He brought up more artillery, more tanks, more infantry. He tightened the noose around the Oosterbeek perimeter, squeezing it relentlessly. The pressure was immense, and the British were beginning to buckle. For the High Command, both British and German, the battle at Arnhem had become a strategic and symbolic focal point. For Montgomery, it was a personal humiliation. His master plan, the one that was supposed to end the war, was failing spectacularly. He could not bring himself to admit it, not yet. He continued to urge Horrocks and XXX Corps forward, demanding more speed, more aggression. But the reality on the ground was inescapable. XXX Corps was still miles from Arnhem, still fighting its way up Hell's Highway, still being delayed by German ambushes and destroyed bridges. The link-up was not going to happen. For the German High Command, the destruction of the British 1st Airborne was a massive propaganda victory. It proved that the German army was not defeated, that it could still inflict a major defeat on the Allies. It was a much-needed boost to German morale at a time when the war seemed lost. The red berets of the British paratroopers, once a symbol of Allied invincibility, were now being used by German propagandists as a symbol of British arrogance and folly. As the 4th day of the battle began, the situation for the 1st Airborne was becoming untenable. The perimeter was shrinking, the casualties were mounting, and the hope of relief was all but gone. The men were at the end of their physical and mental endurance. They had fought with incredible bravery, but they were only human. They could not hold out forever. The end was near. The bridge at Arnhem, the bridge too far, had become a bridge of death, a monument to a failed plan, and the thousands of young men who had paid the ultimate price for for. The red berets that had floated down so proudly from the sky just a few days before were now scattered across the battlefield, a tragic, bloody carpet marking the place where a grand ambition had met a brutal reality. The agony of waiting. The roar of a single Spitfire engine was a sound of desperate hope for the men trapped in the Oostbeek perimeter. It was the 5th day, and the situation was beyond critical. Ammunition was virtually exhausted, with men down to their last 5 rounds of rifle ammunition. Medical supplies were non-existent. The wounded lay in cellars, their wounds untended, flies swarming over them in the damp, foul air. Food was a memory, replaced by a gnawing hunger that sapped what little strength remained. The only thing that kept the German tide at bay was the sheer, bloody-minded courage of the paratroopers and the dwindling but deadly accurate artillery support from the south side of the Rhine. The Spitfires were their lifeline, not for reinforcements but for supplies. They flew in at tree-top level, braving a wall of German flak to drop canisters of food, medicine, and ammunition. But many of the canisters fell short, landing in German lines or in the river, their precious contents lost. The few that made it into the perimeter were the cause of frantic, dangerous scrambles as men risked their lives to retrieve them under enemy fire. The sight of a parachute descending, not with a soldier, but with a canister of bandages or bullets, was the most poignant symbol of their isolation. They were being sustained, not by a breakthrough, but by a threat. In his command post in the Hartenstein Hotel, the division's headquarters in Oostbeek, Major General Roy Urquhart faced an impossible choice. A quiet, studious man who had missed the initial drop due to a botched glider landing. He had fought his way back to his division and now commanded a dying force. He was a man crushed by the weight of responsibility. The reports from his commanders were unanimous. They could not hold out for another night. The Germans were preparing for a final, massive assault to crush them once and for all. Urquhart knew that to stay was to invite annihilation. The only option was a retreat, a withdrawal across the Rhine under the cover of darkness. It was a humiliating prospect, a tacit admission of defeat, but it was the only way to save what was left of his division. He radioed the request to his superiors, to General Browning, and ultimately to Montgomery. The response was agonizingly slow. For hours, the men in the perimeter waited, their fate hanging in the balance, while the High Command debated the merits of a retreat versus the political cost of abandoning the operation. For the soldiers on the ground, it was another betrayal, another sign that their lives were being gambled with by men far from the front lines. At the bridge, the ordeal of Lieutenant Colonel Frost and his men was finally over. After 4 days of constant, brutal combat, their position had become untenable. The buildings they occupied were burning ruins. Frost himself was severely wounded and trapped in the cellar of his headquarters. The German attacks were relentless, and the British soldiers could no longer hold them back. One by one, the houses were taken, the defenders killed or captured. By the evening of the 4th day, the last pockets of resistance at the bridge were silenced. Frost and the remaining able-bodied men were taken prisoner. The capture of the bridge was a major victory for the Germans, but it was a hollow one. The bridge itself had been damaged by the fighting and was unusable for heavy traffic. More importantly, the sacrifice of Frost's battalion had tied down significant German forces for days, preventing them from joining the assault on the main Oostbeek perimeter. The red berets that had defended the bridge were gone, either killed, captured, or scattered in the rubble. But their stand had become a legend, a symbol of courage against impossible odds. For the men of XXX Corps, still struggling up Hell's Highway, the news from Arnhem was a bitter pill to swallow. They had fought their way to Nijmegen, capturing the bridge there after a costly and heroic assault by the American 82nd Airborne and the British Guards Armored Division. The road to Arnhem was now open theoretically, but they were exhausted. Their tanks were battered and in need of repair. Their infantry was depleted, and they were still over 10 miles from the beleaguered British paratroopers. The German forces between them and Arnhem were still strong, and they had had days to prepare new defenses. The commanders of XXX Corps knew that a final push to Arnhem was now impossible. They had failed. The cavalry was not coming. The realization of this failure spread through the ranks, a wave of bitterness and frustration. They had fought hard, they had lost good men, but it had all been for nothing. The bridge at Arnhem remained tantalizingly close, but impossibly far away. In the Oostbeek perimeter, the waiting was finally over. The order came through late on the 5th day, Operation Berlin. The retreat was on. The plan was simple but incredibly dangerous. Under the cover of darkness, the entire remaining force, over 2,000 men, would make their way to the riverbank, where Canadian engineers in small boats would ferry them across to the south bank. It was a monumental task, fraught with peril. The Germans were certain to detect the movement and would unleash their full firepower. The wounded would have to be carried, a slow and agonizing process. As darkness fell, an eerie quiet settled over the battlefield. The usual artillery bombardment ceased. The men, knowing what was at stake, began to move silently, slipping through the German lines in small groups. The tension was unbearable. Every Every snapped twig, every cough seemed to echo in the stillness. They moved like ghosts, shadows flitting through the ruins of their own battlefield. The evacuation was a scene of organized chaos and quiet heroism. At the riverbank, the men huddled in the reeds, waiting for the boats. The Canadian engineers worked tirelessly, rowing back and forth under constant machine gun and mortar fire. The Germans, alerted to the withdrawal, began to lay down a murderous barrage. Traces stitched across the water, and mortar rounds exploded among the waiting men, killing and maiming. But the paratroopers held their discipline. They helped the wounded into the boats first, their faces etched with pain and exhaustion. There was no panic, only a grim determination to get out. Private James Simpson, his shoulder wound throbbing, helped carry a stretcher case down to the water's edge. The man on the stretcher was barely conscious, his face ashen. As they loaded him into a small rowboat, Simpson looked back at the burning town of Oosterby. He thought of all the men who had been left behind, the dead and the captured. He thought of the red berets that lay scattered in the mud and rubble. He felt a profound sense of loss, a grief so deep it felt like a physical pain. He had survived, but a part of him had died in that cauldron. By the early hours of the morning, the evacuation was complete. Just over 2,100 men of the 1st Airborne Division had made it across the Rhine. Nearly 1,500 were dead, and over 6,500 were captured. The division had ceased to exist as a fighting force. It had been destroyed in 9 days of brutal combat. The men who made it across were hollow-eyed, exhausted, and broken. They had been through hell. They had seen their friends killed, their hopes dashed, their proud unit annihilated. They were the survivors of a great defeat, and they carried the weight of that defeat with them. As they stumbled away from the river, away from the sound of the guns, they left behind a battlefield that would forever be associated with their sacrifice. They left behind their dead, their wounded, and their red berets, the final, poignant symbols of a bridge that had been, quite literally, a bridge too far. The silence after the storm, the dawn that broke over the Rhine on September 26, 1944, was a silent one. The thunder of artillery, the rattle of machine gun fire, the screams of the wounded, all the sounds that had defined the battlefield for 9 terrible days, had ceased. An unnatural quiet had settled over the ruins of Arnhem and Oosterby, a quiet more profound and unsettling than the noise of battle. It was the silence of a graveyard. For the German soldiers who now moved cautiously through the shattered streets, the scene was one of utter devastation. Buildings were smoldering husks, their interiors exposed to the gray sky. The ground was littered with the debris of war, shell casings, broken weapons, abandoned equipment, and the bodies of the fallen. And everywhere, scattered among the rubble like poppies in a field of Flanders, were the red berets of the British paratroopers. Some were stained with blood, others caked in mud. A few were surprisingly pristine, as if they had just been dropped there. For the Germans, these berets were trophies, grim souvenirs of a hard-fought victory. They picked them up, pocketed them, a tangible reminder of the enemy they had crushed. In the hastily established prisoner of war camps, the survivors of the 1st Airborne Division began to comprehend the full scale of their defeat. They were a ragged, broken collection of men, many of them wounded, all of them exhausted and hungry. They were searched, their personal possessions taken, their identities recorded. The camaraderie that had sustained them in the perimeter was still there, a shared bond of suffering and loss, but it was now tinged with a deep sense of bitterness and humiliation. They had been told they were the elite, that they would be home by Christmas. Instead, they were prisoners of war, facing an uncertain and likely brutal future. They thought of their friends who had not made it, who lay dead in the fields and streets of Oosterby. They thought of the bridge, the objective they had never reached. The red berets that had once been a source of such pride were now a symbol of their failure, a constant reminder of the arrogance that had led them into this trap. They were the men who had fought for a bridge too far, and they had paid the price. For the Dutch civilians who emerged from their cellars and hiding places, the sight that greeted them was one of horror and heartbreak. Their towns were destroyed, their homes in ruins. The fields where they had once grown crops were now scarred by shell holes and littered with the wreckage of gliders and planes. And the bodies were everywhere. Men in red berets, young men who had come to liberate them, now lay dead in their streets and gardens. The Dutch people who had greeted the paratroopers with such joy and hope now wept for them. They buried the dead where they fell, marking the grave with simple wooden crosses. They tended to the wounded, both British and German, with what little they had. They shared their meager food supplies with the starving prisoners. Their liberation had turned into a nightmare, a brutal battle fought on their doorstep that had left their communities in ruins. The red beret became a sacred symbol for them, a reminder of the sacrifice made by the young men who had come to free them, and of the terrible cost of war. At SHAEF headquarters in Versailles and at 21st Army Group in Belgium, the news of the failure of Market Garden was met with shock and disbelief. Montgomery, who had been so confident of success, was stunned. He would not accept that his plan had been flawed. He blamed the weather, the terrain, the failure of the American airborne units units to capture all their bridges quickly enough. The slow progress of XXX Call. He blamed everyone but himself. It was a classic case of a commander unable to admit his own mistakes. The truth, however, was undeniable. Market Garden had been a catastrophic failure. It had resulted in the destruction of an elite Allied division, had failed to secure a crossing over the Rhine, and had extended the war by months, if not years. The optimism that had permeated the Allied high command was gone, replaced by a grim realism. The war was not over. It would not be over by Christmas. It would go on through another long, cold, and bloody winter. The Red Berets of the 1st Airborne were a silent indictment of that failure, a symbol of the dangers of hubris and overconfidence. For the men of XXX Corps who had fought their way up Hell's Highway only to be stopped short of their objective, the mood was one of bitter frustration. They had done everything that had been asked of them. They had fought hard, they had taken casualties, they had captured their objectives, but it had all been for nothing. The bridge at Arnhem had been lost, and with it, the chance to end the war quickly. They felt that they had been let down, that the plan had been flawed from the start, that they had been asked to do the impossible. They looked back at the road they had traveled, a road littered with the wreckage of their own tanks and the bodies of their own men, and they wondered what it had all been for. The Red Berets of the Airborne were a constant reminder of the men they had failed to reach, the men who had been sacrificed for a faulty plan. Battle of Arnhem became a legend, a story of courage against impossible odds, of a magnificent defeat. It was studied in military academies around the world, a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating the enemy and the perils of a plan that relies on everything going perfectly. The phrase, "a bridge too far," entered the lexicon, a metaphor for any ambitious plan that exceeds its grasp. But for the men who fought there, for the survivors and the families of the dead, it was not a metaphor. It was a reality. It was 9 days of hell, of fear, of pain, of loss. It was the sight of their friends lying dead in a foreign field. It was the memory of the Red Berets, scattered like fallen leaves on the ground. The silence that fell after the battle was not a peace. It was a silence of mourning, a silence of remembrance, a silence that would echo for generations. Section Conclusion Epilogue. The weight of a beret. The dust of Arnhem settled long ago, but the echoes of the battle remain, not in the thunder of guns, but in the quiet corners of memory and history. Operation Market Garden stands as a permanent fixture in the landscape of World War II, not as a triumph of arms, but as a profound and cautionary tale. It is a story etched in the cold calculus of numbers. Nearly 15,000 Allied casualties, the virtual annihilation of a proud airborne division, and a war prolonged through a bitter winter, costing countless more lives. Yet to reduce Arnhem to mere statistics is to miss its true, enduring weight. The battle's legacy is carried not in ledgers, but in the symbolic heft of a simple piece of felt, the Red Beret. That beret, once a bold declaration of elite status, became the ultimate symbol of the battle's tragic paradox. It represents the breathtaking courage of men who jumped into the unknown, holding a bridge against overwhelming odds for days longer than anyone thought possible. It is a testament to the human spirit's capacity for defiance in the face of certain doom. But simultaneously, that same beret, lying abandoned in the mud of Oosterbeek or atop the grave of a teenage paratrooper, is a stark indictment of the hubris that sent them there. It is the physical embodiment of a plan that confused audacity with wisdom, that mistook wishful thinking for intelligence. The Red Beret is both a medal of honor and a mark of Cain, a duality that forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that the line between a brilliant gamble and a foolish blunder is often drawn only in retrospect, in the blood of the fallen. The lesson of Arnhem transcends the specifics of 1944. It is a timeless human lesson, relevant to every boardroom, every government chamber, every endeavor where ambition outstrips caution. It whispers a warning that the greatest dangers are not the enemies we face, but the assumptions we carry. It teaches that victory is not a reward for boldness alone, but for boldness tempered by humility, by a clear-eyed assessment of reality, no matter how inconvenient it may be. The bridge at Arnhem was too far not because of the miles on a map, but because of the distance between the Allied High Command's perception and the brutal truth on the ground. In the end, the men in the Red Berets paid the price for that distance. Their story is not just a chapter in a history book. It is a permanent, poignant question posed to all who hold power and ambition. How far is too far, and who pays when you find out?